So this should hopefully be very interesting talk, just really getting a European perspective on. Yari has talked did one or two talks at Immert and the European Media Creative Fund, and just really to get a European perspective and maybe just tell us about the EGDF as well. So Jari, thanks for joining us. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you for inviting me, and well, what I can say now, something for completely different. So going from inspiring stories from 1980s and 1990s to the how to get public funding for your game. But still, getting funding might be a very important topic for you. So I hope you can see the slide now. Does it work?
Yeah, we can indeed.
Yes. Good. So let's move forward. EGDF. So EGDF is an European umbrella organization of games industry. We unite 18 trade associations all over Europe. Those associations represent more than 2,500 game developer studios that employ over 40,000 people. And what do we do? Of course, important thing for us is to share information between our members. We are aggregating industry data on the European level, calculating the total size of the European industry, try to harmonize statistical framework on that side. And also best practices. Lately, we have worked a lot on how to cut CO2 emissions of the industry and what to do on that side. And we help our members on building joint approach on the implementation of the European regulation. Something to keep in mind also in Ireland is that the new copyright rules should be entering the force this summer or in the autumn, depending on how delayed they are, because they are delayed in most of the European countries. And there will be a new set of consumer protection rules entering into force in the beginning of 2022. But those are a topic for another presentation. And of course, we defend games industry interest on upcoming regulation like opposing digital levies on taxation side. Now we are trying to push platforms in the right place in the value chain by defending game developer studios in the Digital Market Act and so on. But all in all, we focus on access to funding for game developers, access to talent for game developers, access to markets. So we try to reduce the regulatory fragmentation on the global level and access to data. And this the last part is a particularly new topic. So increasingly, the regulatory challenge is about who has the right to access to data in the value chain. And defending game developers on that side is really, really important. But today, we will be focusing on the first part, access to funding. So there are two major trends here that make this topic really important for the European game developer studios at the moment. Of course, you all have seen all the headlines saying that games industry is doing well. It's one of the few industries that has been growing through the pandemic, as people have been downloading more games, playing more games, and even spending more money in games. But unfortunately, there are lots of studios that are struggling to access funding, especially the first round studios, first round startups are the ones that are struggling the most. Games industry events went down, were replaced by digital events, and pitching your games in the digital environment where it's very, very challenging to have this kind of hands-on experience on how the game works or prototype works. It's very, very difficult. And also there has been delays in this kind of pipeline of finalizing the agreements with the publishers or the investors. So it has been really, really rough year for many small studios or micro studios and first round startup studios. And yeah, what we are trying to do on the European level at the moment is to summarize the upcoming calls for EU grants like the Creative Europe, more about that later. And also something that we have worked for years is unleashing the full potential of the European games industry funds with the help of Invest EU Media Invest funding. So in the beginning of the next year, European Union will be launching a new instrument targeted for games industry specific or media specific investment funds. And as access to the US venture capital funds or Asian venture capital funds is at the moment due to travel restrictions and other topics reasons so much more difficult than before. We are trying to now encourage European venture capital funds focusing games industry to go more cross-border, and also start also invest in European studios that are not located in their own old home territories, like Finnish funds or German funds. It's just been a pity that we have lost access to the UK funds for a while, but let's see where that goes. Hopefully also we see funds like London Venture Partners entering the EU games venture capital market soon again. I think they are already making progress on that side. Second trend is the fact that due to challenges with the European state aid framework, it's much harder to build public support instruments for games industry than, for example, film industry. And there we are trying to secure that in the review of general block exemption regulation and the minimis rules, games industry would be treated the same way as the film industry and have the same rules and the same limitations. At the moment, all the cultural instruments for games industry, for example, have to be notified in Brussels, whereas film industry side, you can just launch your own national initiatives with certain limitations. So before we go to the European funding, let's have a look on how the local support for games industry in Ireland compare with other European countries. And when we think about what is the most important, most impactful policy document or guiding set of principles that policymakers can use to guide the games industry, it's the funding application form. Because those are something that every game developer studio will study in detail. And what is written in the funding application form has a big impact on the mindset of the developers, on how they approach their games, because when they are pitching them for the public sector. And if you are fulfilling this kind of document, thinking your games from a certain perspective, that idea, that perspective will have an impact on the mindset of the whole local industry. For example, here is the criteria for UK creative industry tax relief. And it focuses a lot on cultural content, cultural contributions, and cultural practices. And that's mainly coming from the European state aid rules, where there is a specific exception for cultural state aid. And of course, in order to fulfill that criteria, the cultural state aid for video games have to prove that they are cultural content. And that, of course, places content in the focus. You think about your content as a cultural medium. You think about different ways to improve the artistic nature of the games. And that's, of course, a good thing. And if you have a look on the Finnish support instrument, that is R&D funding for games, there it's not the content. It's game platforms, game development tools, business models, new cross-media concepts, game concepts in general beyond content alone, or gamification. So instead of focusing specifically on content, you start to think about business models, you start to think about technologies behind the game, and that guides your thinking. And that's, again, a good thing. But it's a different kind of mindset, and it directs the industry to a different direction. So, if we have a look on the cultural state aid for video game production, Ireland is not doing that badly, actually. It's, I would say, in the middle class. It's not where France, that has lots of different kind of cultural instruments, something for grants, something for loans, something for tax credits, something we are trying to, at the moment, map out is what's actually the name of the equity instrument that is rumored to be. But yeah, and we are really so happy to hear that in Ireland there is currently discussions on the introduction of the third European tax credit scheme for video games as a cultural product in Europe. So hope to hear more about that soon, especially if you have to notify it in Brussels, when we have lots of experience on that process. But luckily lately, if you are following the French or UK model in your scheme, it should be business as usual for the Commission, and it should go through rather quickly. But yeah, as you can see from here, cultural state aid for video game production is something that is present in the most of the European countries. And it really guides the game developers to focus on content. And France is, of course, a great example of the number of narrative storytelling artistic games they are creating. But in the Nordic countries, for example, Denmark, it's the hub of the indie games, pioneering games, creating new content, really pushing the boundaries of games industry as a creative medium, greatly because of the cultural state aid. That's really directs their startups to think their games as an artistic product, really push the boundaries to that direction. On the other hand, if you think about success of the local industries, Danish industry is much smaller than the Finnish industry. That is the third largest in Europe at the moment. And that's also because their focus is on the content, not so much on the business models, monetizations, and the technological side of the games. And that's where the R&D steps in. And this is something where the Finnish system is particularly interesting because the Finnish state aid for video games industry is really focused on R&D support. And that pushes the game developer studios to think about their tools. So it's not a surprise that there are many Finnish game developer studios that have better tools for game development than their games are. And that's also the reason why, for example, Unity Ads business is running from Helsinki, because there was a game developer studio that was so good at creating this kind of ad services that Unity bought them, not because of their games, but for their ad technology. And it also pushes the studios to think about monetization. Like the reason why we have Supercell is partly because from the beginning of the company history, they have been in talks with the Business Finland on R&D grants on business development. So that gives another direction for the industry. And Ireland on this side is again, there are some general support instruments on this side as well. So good middle class, but many of the other countries have much larger variety of different kind of R&D instruments. And the challenge for Europe is that it's very difficult to combine cultural state aid with an R&D state aid. Sorry, I have the wrong title in this slide. So because of copy-paste mistake, this slide is all about R&D state aid. So it's very hard to combine those two elements. And what is really lacking in Europe at the moment is a country that would be able to combine R&D funding with the cultural state aid. The third type of funding that we have on the local level is SME support. And there again, Ireland is doing well. It's a good middle class. There are lots of different kind of instruments available. But something to keep in mind with SME funding is that it's usually focused on starting your business and creating your studio, but how to scale it up, how to create an industry that creates profits, that has ways to really push the boundaries of the industry from the cultural or the R&D perspective. You need different instruments for that. And Belgium is here a good example. They are really supporting their grassroots side of the industry, but there is very little support from the cultural or from the R&D side to actually build a business on the beginning of your first round, on the top of your first round studio or second round studio. But yeah, they are also going forward. So yeah, the environment in Ireland is, I would say, rather good. And there are lots of opportunities for the game developer studios from the public funding side. But there are, of course, some now new interesting EU funding instruments to keep in mind as well that might provide some new interesting opportunities for you. But the trick with the funding is not so much on are you able to catch all the different opportunities, but it's more about identifying the instruments that really work for you. So if you are really wanting to build something that is focused on monetization, this kind of game that is really reaching maximum audience, then perhaps R&D support might be for you. But if you want to create something that is really great from the cultural content side, then go for the cultural funding. And also something to keep in mind is the fact that the most expensive funding is quite often the public funding. So if you take a loan from a bank, you have to pay interest for that, but you can use the money for your company. So for equity, there might be some guidance. You might lose control of your company to the investors, but still have that money almost completely for your company. But when you go to the cultural grants, or especially the European R&D grants, there is more and more red tape and administrative burden involved. There is more project-related risks and complexity involved. So those things means that, for example, with the Horizon Europe or Digital Europe project, you need one full-time person just to take care of the reporting, all the administration, and all the meetings and other things related to the project, in order to secure that it doesn't really move the focus of your company to the areas where that are not in your strategic focus. So there are lots of public funding opportunities, but be smart about which one to choose. So perhaps the most interesting and least talked European funding instrument, or this kind of support model, is the European Investment Bank and European Investment Fund support for banks and investment companies to scale up their investment portfolio or loans, or reduce the risk of the loans by loan guarantees. And in exchange of public support, those banks and investment funds promise to take risks. And that has been the problem of Europe. Our investors are not risk-taking enough compared to US investors, for example. So this kind of support is really great for game developers looking for loans or equity investment. But the challenge with that investment, those loans, is that usually those banks and funds supported by the EU do not have almost any idea how the games industry works. So you really have to be able to justify for someone who really knows well how, let's say, shipping industry or retail sales work, how to operate in the digital environment with completely different kind of mindset, completely different kind of business models, completely different kind of opportunities. And that has been one of the key challenges for game developer studios on accessing that kind of public funding that is directed for financial intermediaries. Then there are Creative Europe grants for game development. Good news is that Creative Europe funding for game development will continue. It was almost cancelled due to UK leaving the EU. But yeah, thanks partly through the pandemic and the big crisis the cultural industries have faced, the European Parliament and Council decided to invest more in these creative and cultural sectors. And that also means that also support for games industry will continue. The next call will be in the beginning of the end of 2021 and will be closed in the beginning of 2022. It's limited for the developers of the narrative storytelling games. Most likely it will be limited to the part of game development leading to game prototype. But yeah, we don't know the details yet because this will be the first call of the new instrument. And one of the big challenges of the Creative Europe grants has been that beyond the fact that it's a really competitive funding instrument and it's hard to get, is the fact that eligibility criteria change from call to call. Hopefully the instrument will be now more stable than before and the rules will stay the same. But if you qualified for the funding for the one round, you really have to double check if you will be qualifying also in the next round. This of course is a bit of challenge for game developer studios that really would like to know beforehand when to apply for this kind of prototype funding so that it really matches their production cycle as well as possible. And then you have Horizon Europe and Digital Europe programs. The big promise of those programs is that there is billions of euros on the table. And that's, of course, is highly interesting for all the studios looking for public funding. And basically, only few of those program applications go through. So I would see Horizon Europe and Digital Europe more as a way to if you are developing, for example, serious games or health games, for example, if you have potential partners, just these funding application processes are a great way to actually open the doors and talk with your potential customers and partners about the different projects and cooperations you can do. It's not so uncommon at all that failed project consortium continues a cooperation in other means. It's also really interesting for some of the P2P game developers, again, opening the doors to discuss with their potential customers, for example, in Germany with auto industry, or if you're making VR games, for example, in Finland, there has been cooperation with shipyards, for example, on this side. And yeah, especially if you are developing in-house game tools or technologies, then if you are able to see these kind of areas that will support your core technology, but are still a bit outside of your core focus, that might be an interesting instrument for you. I would be a bit hesitant on actually placing your core industry knowledge, or that is kind of your trade secret, in this kind of consortiums, because it's a potentially might mean that you will leak some of your competitive advantage to some of your competitors. It's sometimes said that big companies like Telefonica, who are really active on this side, are using this kind of R&D projects just to have a better look on what is going on in the smaller companies, and then using the best ideas for their own R&D side. So speed smart on that. And a big problem for the game developer studios is that they are huge consortiums, number of partners. There is usually delays with reporting and delays with payments. So it's not really something for a struggling SME that is really would need to fund the support in funding in time without any kind of delays. And again, those details are still a bit unknown, like what will be the focus on ways these new instruments will work. But any day now, we will know more. Yeah, so my tip for the day, something to do if you are interested in public funding from the European side, is to go to accesstofinance.eu and see what kind of Irish financial intermediaries they are, on what kind of support, on what kind of investments or loans they are willing to give to the SMEs or developer studios in general. And when you contact them, you can always say that, yeah, you are getting this EU funding for taking risks. And the games industry is definitely a risky business, and they should be now also more comfortable with this public support to go a bit more on their uncomfort zone, to go outside their comfort zone. Yeah, that's about it. We have a policy analyst, Philipp Kramer from Germany, who is working with these funding instruments and is a specialist on that side, so don't hesitate to contact him if you have further questions. But are there any questions from the audience at the moment?
Thank you, Jari, for that brilliant presentation and analysis of European funding. We do actually have a question, but it was very interesting seeing Ireland compared to other countries as regards. I've never seen that, so really thank you for that slide. It was very, very interesting, and for policymakers in this country as well to compare us to other European countries. I saw something that you shared recently on what the Finnish industry and the growth. The spectacular growth of the Finnish industry. I must share that myself. But just interesting seeing their funding mechanisms as well. So really useful for, I suppose, and for game development companies here as well to hear about. Also that the creative media. I didn't realize that there was an issue with funding, that the creative media for games. So good to hear it's going to continue. That's some companies have done. So basically, yeah, one question from Tom Conlon, and you probably, I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but question was how do or will the creative funds from the EU interact with the upcoming budget changes in Ireland, the tax credit that's going to come in here? I don't think there's a direct one, is there? Maybe.
Yeah. Well, this is a rather complex question. There might be some surprises always. You never know how the jungles of the bureaucratic frameworks in the end actually work. But with tax breaks, there shouldn't be any kind of problems on combining that with, for example, equity funding or loan funding at all. Same applies for the EU instruments in general, because usually the EU funding instruments like grants are not calculated in a part of the de minimis funding, and that should be helpful. But it's always something good to keep in mind and good to double check if you are applying for the funding, because there might be some surprises. Suddenly, now we have relaxed, for example, the de minimis rules on thresholds because of the corona crisis. But there might be a point of time in the future where the de minimis rules are again becoming more stricter, and there might be this kind of overlap happening at some point where then suddenly the rules change a bit, and that's of course the nasty side of the public funding, that it's sometimes a bit unpredictable impacts.
Yes,
and especially something to keep in mind is not so much related to actually the tax breaks in the UK, but something that has repeatedly across Europe caused challenges for Europe is that if you get too high share of investment from the big company, let's say you sell 51% of your company, or let's say 30% of your company to the big your publisher or something like that, you might lose your SME status. And when you lose your SME status, you will also lose access to a number of public funding instruments.
Yes, it is very complex. Jari, listen, thank you so much for that talk and that presentation. And just for anybody, the EGDF, if I'm pronouncing it right, European Game Developer Federation, please check out their site. They have a wealth of information on the different game agencies in Europe, and some really good research as well. So again, thank you so much, Jari, for that very interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Bye.